Hello, leeches, mealworms, and animalcules of all types. I'm Shay, or frillSquid, and I will be conducting this journey through early medicine and natural magic. A few warnings before we begin. First of all, I'm going to focus on European magic and medicine. That's because it's the most accessible to an Anglophone nerd like I am. It's the worst, and it's generally just what people are going to be most familiar with. I'm neither a historian nor a medical professional. I have about as much medical competence as some of the fine doctors you'll learn about this evening, so please do not take any of this as medical advice. I am going to be mean to the French and astrologers. If you are a French person, an astrologer, or both, please keep this in mind. There may be sensitive content, such as me insulting you. And with that, let's get into the introduction. All right, here's our table of contents about me, classical philosophy, that's ancient Greece and Rome, the Arab world, how the Europeans got to this stuff, medical astrology, medicine and the Black Plague, natural magic, and prayer. They work together very well. Medicine as a career, how people made money out of this, because capitalism. Obstetrics, the one shining bright point. Germ theory and microscopy, which was the beginning of the end for all of this nonsense, the beginning of vaccines, and modern resurgences of natural magic and old-timey medical stuff. At the end, there will be a Q&A, which convinces of you asking me why I've done this and me just smiling and nattering in response. All right, so about me, my name is Shay. You can also call me frillSquid. Either is good. I use they, them pronouns. I am a library studies graduate student. I'm primarily, when I'm not stuck in work clothes, I work punk Lolita or OG or whatever I can steal from the Halloween kids section at Target without nobody noticing. I took one class on the history of the scientific revolution in college, but I really enjoyed it. All of the slides for this PowerPoint are going to be typeset in Garamond, which is a historically accurate, like 15th century typeface. So that's a fun fact for y'all. So the classical philosophy of medicine, this is where the nonsense all started. Hippocrates was an ancient Greek guy. He was said to be descended directly from Asclepius, the god of medicine, but that's a real citation needed on my part. And his main things that he came up with were the Hippocratic corpus, which was like 60 different books he or people who said they were Hippocrates wrote, and the Hippocratic Oath, which I'm sure you're familiar with. First, do no harm. Second, all that other stuff. Galen he was Roman, and he took a lot of the Hippocratic corpus and Hippocratic stuff, refined them, developed them, created his own directions, and those were the two big boys. Here on the right, we have a medieval illustration of the two of them just chilling. Don't mind the hundreds of years age gap. It's fine. They're medieval. Moving on to what they actually came up with. The primary things they came up with were miasma theory and natural causation. So natural causation is basically the principle that, unlike what people thought back then, you're not sick because God hates you or gods variously hate you. You're sick because something is causing you to be sick. And one of those proposed things that caused you to be sick was miasmas. So we have some kind of smelling cloth or salt or something here, because this man, obviously, he has fallen sick because he smelled a real bad miasma. And that's what's going on there. So by making him smell different, gooder stuff, he's going to feel better. This is the greatest advance in medicine that they had experienced back then in the European lands, which is kind of upsetting. Moving on, the big thing that you may know is the four humors, Humorism. Here on the right, we have a helpful chart. If you can't read Italian, now is a great time to learn. But basically, there are four humors that are balanced together in the body, as with the four elements that they believed made up the world in Aristotelian philosophy. So you had air, which was the best version, which corresponded to blood and the sanguine temperament. And Michelangelo, I don't know my Ninja Turtles. Earth, which was the worst one, it corresponded to black bile, also known as crap, and being an introvert, and generally people didn't like that then. Fire, which corresponded to yellow bile, or the choleric temperament, or being real angry all the time. And water, which corresponded to phlegm or mucus, and was phlegmatic. And of course, phlegmatic people would be pale and non-confrontational. So this was a guiding principle for several years. It's comparable to yin and yang in Chinese philosophy, and also five elements in Chinese philosophy. So choleric is the one that's for extroverts who are task oriented. Sanguine is for extroverts who are people oriented. Phlegmatic is for extroverts who are, for introverts who are people oriented. And melancholic is for introverts who are task oriented. And basically, there's kind of a hierarchy that's developed amongst that. But all of them can be bad in excess, was the principle that they came up with. Moving on. So, how did they get these classical philosophies over from our buds in the ancient Greek and Latin speaking types of the world over to the modern church Latin? It was the Arab world. The Arab world is the only reason that anybody knew a dang thing. So, starting out with Al-Kindi was I believe the Latin name for him, because they didn't use Arabic names, was Al-Kindis. And Al-Kindi developed a lot of the humoral theory. He translated a lot of things, and he used music theory and astrology to further flesh out the humors. Ibn Sina was from Persia, and he fleshed out a lot of Galenic stuff, as did Ibn Rushd. They were known as Avicenna and Averroes by medieval Latin speakers, which just tells you should really learn Arabic if you're going to use Arabic. And Al-Zahrawi was the father of surgery. Interestingly enough, although Al-Kindi and Ibn Sina were both parts of what we consider to be the Middle East today, Ibn Rushd and Al-Zahrawi were both from Andalusia, or what was Spain before the Reconquista. So, in short, we should totally give Spain back to Morocco. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. All right, so medical astrology was the legally allowed branch of astrology. Basically, you could have astrology that predicted your health, like if you were born in Aries, you were going to be angry. That's obvious, because look at me. But if you predicted astrology, like if your Aries today shows that you're going to fall in love or whatever, that predictive astrology was very illegal and could lead to accusations of witchcraft, which is not cash money. It was also tied to astronomy. There really wasn't a difference between astrology as a study of the stars, how they interacted with humans, and astronomy is the study of the stars themselves. This is because they really weren't felt to be different at all, that the stars were physically in spheres that floated several miles above the Earth, and they were physically rotating in celestial spheres with celestial music, and if you got a catapult big enough, you could meet God, and that's why there was no difference between the supernatural and the natural back then. Moving on, here's something that displays the connections between the different humors and the different astrological signs. So you can see over here, we also have some alchemical stuff. This would be a great alchemical recipe if you can read it. So it was very entwined with humorism, because obviously angry reacts only mean angry reacts only. And it was used both for diagnostics and for treatments. So maybe you go into the doctor, they take a look at your astrological chart, they say, oh, it's Venus's fault. You need to wait and also burn some herbs or what the heck ever, and then Mars will be with you. I know nothing about how astrology works, and I'm not about to learn today. All right, so medicine in the Black Plague. This is a major turning point because the population went way down. There were 3 types of plague. There were bubonic plague, which is our classic big old knots and gross pustules and all that stuff. Pneumonic plague, which affected the, oh my gosh, I just realized how small that cat is. Thank you so much. Pneumonic plague, which affected the lungs and was respiratory and had an even higher death rate than bubonic plague, and septicemic plague, which basically turned your blood and flesh and organs into a delicious smoothie filled with plague and had basically 100% death rate. So they tried to use a lot of different cures for the plague. Most of them didn't work. The most effective one was running like heck and never returning to where you came from. But they came up with some novel ones that went against the Galenic Hippocratic idea of natural causes for medicine. For example, the flagellants were a sect of Christians who went around not bathing, breathing on people all the time, and flogging themselves in dirty clothes or naked so that God would see their punishment and that he would take the plague away. It was the opposite of effective. Another thing that came from the Black Plague and affected medicine was there were just huge amounts of anti-Semitism and xenophobia that went around, that people decided it was because of Jewish people poisoning wells, which as a Jewish people, I have not poisoned a well once, and I wouldn't be able to cause plague by that either. But they were scared, and, you know, it's easy to ignore all your neighbors who are Jewish and also dying when you're filled with fear and spite. So medicine in the Black Plague, a major step back. And here we have a lovely woodcut with some dudes, some death, and of course a cat. This is also the time period when people were starting to lose faith in the church as the sole proprietor of knowledge, because obviously praying the plague away did not work. Nothing worked. All right, so natural magic was coined by Giambattista della Porta in his book, which is basically natural magic in Latin. The English title was Natural Magic. And basically, he had the idea where magic, which can mean a lot of things, but basically he had the idea that there was bad magic, which is witchcraft and evil, and we shouldn't do that. But basically, there are all these different powers embedded in nature and the natural world that we interact with every day. And through the power of prayer and channeling nature, we can channel this magic into doing some really great stuff. That was basically his idea. It may be called natural magic today, but sorry, it's really applied science for back then. And like I said, this is the cover of his 20-book series. It's a translated one. There's his handsome mug down there, the different elements, air, fire, water, and earth, Q Avatar theme, and nature and art. Is this allowed? Anyways. So one form of natural magic people used was prayer. Prayer is very common to people now, especially if you've been exposed to a certain variety of Christianity. But it was very interesting back then, in a day when people were typically illiterate if they were Christian, and typically illiterate if they were Muslim or Jewish, that here is a curse tablet. It's made of lead. And basically what you would do is you would write down or pay somebody who knew how to read to write down a curse on somebody you hate. and then you would roll it up and you would poke nails in it, and the curse would go to them. The opposite would be amulets, which would be written items that, or symbols such as a cross, a short verse from the Quran, anything that you would use to protect yourself. And a lot of times, rather than disposing of a damaged Quran or Bible in a standard way, people would turn those verses into a different amulet or some kind of way to safeguard their health. This is especially interesting in the very diverse context of Andalusia, because in Andalusia, Al-Andalus, they had Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in relative harmony until 1492 happened. And basically, if you were Muslim, you would go to either a priest or a rabbi because other people's magic works better than yours. If you were Jewish, you'd go to a priest or an imam, and if you were Christian, you'd go to a rabbi or an imam. That they had cultural exchange through the protective value of prayer and the written word. And I think that's very special. All right, moving on. Here's another thing that came out of natural magic. Herbalism. This herbal is actually a 1550 reprint of an herbal from, I believe, the 1st century CE, but it was very common back then for people to use herbal medicines. Now, there was kind of a disconnect between the academic written usage of herbal medicines and the folk usage of herbal medicines, but generally because the folk usage was used primarily by women and the academic usage was captained by men, the academic usage had a certain amount of prestige that the folk usage did not. So this is from the first book of, de Herbarium or something. It's a very generic title, and this is on mulberries. So I can't read a ton of this, but basically unripe mulberries are interesting because they cause a laxative effect and sometimes a hallucinogenic effect is one thing. They mentioned the different types of mulberries. There are white mulberries and black mulberries. You can make a water-based tincture decoction out of them and use that for medical purposes. And it just has a lot of different information about them. Another thing that came about through herbalism and the focus on natural magic, that is the power of the physical world and the spiritual world to interact without any Victorian nonsense like veils, is the Doctrine of Signatures. So on the right, we have our handsome fella. This is a liverwort. A liverwort, if you're not familiar with them, are real cutie pies. They're non-vascular plants similar to mosses, except not really. And they were so called because they were thought to resemble the lobes of a liver in medieval England, where the term was coined. So if you look at these, you can imagine it's a liver. I kind of, sort of, maybe get it, but not really. And this Doctrine of Signatures, basically the idea that God or gods had embedded knowledge and resemblance to human organs in plants and animals for the purposes of medicine, were super popular. You get things like eyebright, which is meant to help the eyes, liverwort, all sorts of different things that were supposedly thought to help due to the resemblance. Now, liverwort doesn't do anything, but some of them were incidentally actually pretty accurate. Like, walnuts aren't going to cure your brain, but they do have a resemblance to the brain, and they do have all those good fats that if you have a doctor who's been nagging you about your diet, they would probably be happy to hear you eating walnuts for your brain. So walnuts may contain nuts. There's a near 100% chance, with at least 80% accuracy 90% of the time. Another interesting thing about natural magic and herbalism in particular is that after the Columbian Exchange, that is when European colonizers came over and did some real bad stuff to Turtle Island, the Americas, people no longer were able to rely solely on those old herbals from the 1st century CE. So they had to rely on a combination of indigenous knowledge, which they were bad at procuring, and whatever they made up. So one of the earliest encyclopedias of Columbian exchange knowledge has the fantastic recommendation, everybody buckle your seatbelts, of using chili peppers to help out your eyesight. Yep, that was one of their recommendations. They also had chocolate as an aphrodisiac, which was a common myth, and that lasted up until at least the mid-18th century. Actually, no, at least until the early 19th century. But they had some very interesting things to say about these plants for which the knowledge of the ancients could no longer account. And some of it was good and some of it wasn't so good. All right, let's move on. Medicine as a career. As in all things in medieval through Enlightenment times and in a kind of Western oriented philosophy, there was a hierarchy of medical professionals. So at the top, you had the medical professionals who were university educated, had the equivalent of doctorates. There was a medical university in Salerno, which incorporated Jewish. It was founded by a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian. So it incorporated knowledge from a whole bunch of people. That was at the top. These people knew your horoscope back to front. This illustration here of somebody with a flask full of urine examining it for a diagnosis, they could spot diseased urine a mile away because urinalysis was the dominant method of diagnosis other than looking at your horoscope. And they were just very well trained in what they thought to be the knowledge of the day. There were also guilds that controlled medicine. After those guild doctors and university doctors came the learned surgeons, people who had more background educationally in surgery, because surgery was treated completely different from the other sides of medicine due to the different tools required and the fact that surgery is real icky. And then there were our barber surgeons, which I'm sure you Sweeney Todd fanatics are going to be all about. And then at the bottom, we have our specialists, oculists, dermatologists, though they didn't call them that, people who would go itinerantly town to town, take a look, see, oh, your child can't see. Here's some very suspicious glasses. That'll be like 7 chickens or whatever. There were also empiricists who didn't have formal education, but went on a combination of their own hunches and their own observations, and they were treated pretty poorly, same as specialists. And then at the very bottom, you had clergy who weren't educated as doctors, and even lower than that, not even on the same level, because this wasn't considered a real medical profession. You have midwives, but we'll get to obstetrics and how midwives were the best people ever later on. All right, moving on to the next slide. Here are some people who made bank, well, not really, who made their living off of medicine and related fields. So the first one, Guido de Cauliaco, I chose the Spanish-Italian gloss of his name because he was French and I don't know how to deal with that. He wrote the medieval manuscript on surgery, which was widely disseminated and became the standard basically until modern surgical techniques were introduced with the advent of anesthetic in the 19th century. On the right, we have our handsome boy, Paracelsus. He doesn't get any prettier over time. I'm sorry. And here's a party trick. Everybody listen up. His full name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, and that's what I want to name my cat. Yes, von Hohenheim, like in the animes. I know you're into that probably. And he was the one who came up with this quote, sola dosis facit venenum, basically it's the dose that makes the poison, which he applied to one of the herbal medicines that he developed. Basically, digitalis or foxglove is very poisonous if used improperly, but if used with the correct dosage, can be used to alleviate lymphedema, especially in the legs. So what he did was he developed a dosage scheme for digitalis where you could actually use it and not have adverse effects, which was very good. Andreas Vesalius was one of the big anatomists. He called himself the Prince of Anatomists. He wrote De Humani Corporis Fabrica Receptum, or How the Human Body is Made, in 7 books. And he was one of the first people to really get access to dissecting human bodies, well, ex-human bodies, through various means, legal and illegal. And William Harvey was the big dissector. He also did a lot of work on the vein and arterial system and tensing and releasing muscles. And yeah, whole bunch of dead bodies went missing on account of Andreas Vesalius and William Harvey. So on the right, as I said, we have our handsome boy Paracelsus. Now, fun fact about Paracelsus, he kept moving around a lot, ostensibly to learn more, but partially because he kept on getting run out of town. Some of his cures were very effective, like digitalis. However, one of his cures for the newfound disease syphilis, which was variously called the French disease, the Spanish disease, basically whoever your country was most likely to be racist about, that's where it came from. And for syphilis, he prescribed mercury salts. Now, the great thing about mercury salts and syphilis is they will cover up the symptoms for a time. You won't get any of the nasty pockmarking or other adverse symptoms that mark the earlier stages of late-stage syphilis. However, towards the end, they're going to kill you much faster than the syphilis ever would. So he went into town, he cured some people, he killed some people with mercury salts, and then he quietly left to enjoy the pursuit of more knowledge. Yeah, and he was very rude, but generally less of a bad person than he could have been. He was one of the few prominent doctors who went along without either guild support or some form of royal or governmental support, though there was a form of licensure implemented in some areas. All right, moving on from medicine as a career to obstetrics. Here is the birth of a king in a medieval manuscript. I believe it's Frederick II, but don't quote me on that. So obstetrics was managed by midwives because since Hippocratic times, the dudes just were not prepared to deal with anything obstetrical or gynecological. They were just like, that's a lady problem. We have lady people for that. And they were so wrong, but it kept them from doing more harm, which I guess is what Hippocrates was all about. It was rarely addressed by men, and it was the least horrible. In fact, it was so rarely addressed by men and so inaccessible to men that men were frequently not only disallowed from being near the birthing room, but like they would be physically assaulted for trying to see the birth happen. Yeah, so obstetrics also relied heavily on folk medicines. The herbs used would typically follow oral tradition rather than a formal herbal, and it was an apprenticeship-based program rather than a university-based program as with doctors of other types. So urology was pretty much universal. However, obstetrics and gynecology was very much restricted. And yeah, if you're unaware of the science, humans are not designed to have human babies. The human baby has an enormous head, and the human person with a birth canal has a comparatively small pelvis. So there are a lot of different complications that can occur. And although midwives were able to reach in and resolve some of those, it wasn't until fairly recently that the surgical interventions for like C-sections and breech births that could ensure a much lower death rate from those were developed. Humans aren't designed for anything. For walking, the compression over time of the spine vertebrae it's not pretty. That's why you get so many people with slip discs in their older years. Humans are just not designed for any mileage whatsoever, or designed at all, and I would like a refund. So, germ theory and microscopy. You can tell it's 11 p.m. and it is the beginning of the end for our friend Humorism, Hippocrates, Galen. So there are a lot of people who used ocular lenses. In fact, as I mentioned, by the 14th century, they already had functioning convex lenses for, eyesight. But it was Antony von Leeuwenhoek who took the lenses that pre-existed and created this microscope over here, which could change the magnification and had a measurable magnification. He coined some word for it in Dutch, or several different spellings of the same word for it in Dutch. I don't trust myself with Dutch, especially not 11 p.m. So the English term that was coined was animalcules because they were very small, hence the cule suffix, but they had animalian properties. And this led to modern aseptic technique. Actually, one thing that was interesting about the early years post-microscopy and pre-people learning about how human reproduction strictly worked was that von Leeuwenhoek noted that spermatozoa were a form of animalcules. And he also noted that pond water was full of animalcules. So young ladies of a certain very limited time period often used the excuse that they had gone swimming in a pond to explain any inexplicable pregnancies that occurred. And yeah, the first modern antiseptic used, well, there was alcohol, which was used as a primitive antiseptic and painkiller for surgery for centuries before, but it was phenol, and that's totally interesting, and I can tell you why, but it's chemistry stuff, and I just realized it's only interesting to me, so let's keep going. So vaccines. I'm sure nobody is familiar with what a vaccine is. Although vaccines, as they are today, have only existed for about 2 centuries, the idea of inoculation via exposure to either a disease or a weaker form of the disease has been around for at least a few centuries longer. It's unsure. The historical record is kind of messy on it, but in either China or India, they developed smallpox inoculations by exposing people to either smallpox on humans or cowpox. This is known as the variola virus. And Edward Jenner, no relation to any other Jenners you may or may not have heard of, was the English person who took this idea of vaccination and his own observations about milkmaids who got cowpox not, dying from smallpox all the time. And he developed it into the vaccine. Basically, the first vaccines were literally, here's an infected cow, just touch its udder real good. It'll be fine, I promise. And that wasn't very promising. They later developed it into injection vaccines, and this cartoon is from 1802. It is not from 2021, although political cartoon art has not gotten any worse or better since then. And you can see Edward Jenner injecting people with vaccine and people developing all sorts of complications that I'm sure that you've heard of on YouTube if you frequent that type of stuff. Yeah. If I didn't say it before, vaccine and vaca, the Spanish word for cow, come from the same place because the original vaccine was based from a cow virus, not from the human virus smallpox, which was so deadly. All right, and moving on, the modern resurgence of so-called alternative medicine. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Luckily, most of the astrology inclined people that I know of use it more as a predictive or personal psychological thing rather than using it to determine exactly what their medical situation is. But there are a lot of different modern quote unquote remedies that have popped up despite all of the great things we've developed. So there's essential oils, um, which are pricey and very varyingly effective. For example, some people will do things like put mint oil on themselves, and that can cause chemical burns. Grapefruit oil can also cause chemical burns. There's this thing called black self. Don't go Google it unless you have a super strong stomach. Basically, it's this corrosive compound from like the 1920s where people will just eat away their entire flesh if they think they have a non-benign lesion of some sort. There's homeopathy, which takes the principle of dilution and inverts it completely. So normally when you dilute something down, you have less of it. In homeopathy, if you dilute something down, you have more of it. This is because of magic, and water has memory, I guess, but it doesn't remember being in a sewage plant. Um, Prayer. For only $19.99, you can get somebody very trustworthy on a certain television channel to pray for you, and that'll cure all your ailments. This generally, just like prayer of the olden days, works best on people with no better option. And supplements, named and unnamed, with ingredients listed and without, um, natural or super male, whatever it means. There are tons of supplements that people use in lieu of or in addition to different actual medicines. And the thing is, some of these supplements can be benign, but a lot of the supplements, like St. John's wort, is some of the active compounds are used in medicine. So if you stack that supplement with that medicine, you're getting multiple doses, with one of them being highly variable because of the unregulated nature of supplements, and you're going to just not enjoy it. So that's a very brief history. And holy crap, I really didn't talk as much as I thought I would because I wanted to get through to when I could drink my water. So, does anybody have any questions, or do you want me to freestyle a little bit? I can talk about a few things if you'd like. Please talk to me. I am so bored. Hello, uwu. Okay, I neither hate, I have complex feelings on astrology, and there's several reasons why. Astrology and the queer community were very closely tied in the 80s during a certain public health pandemic, and that's because a lot of medicine and a lot of religion rejected queer people. However, as somebody who feels like just because we have that trauma doesn't mean we can't move on and build a better future for ourselves. And additionally, I feel like I feel like a lot of people who use astrology in the modern day, like a lot of the astrology and tarot readers in the lower income neighborhoods in my area, are really predatory in their business practices. So I find it aesthetically pleasing a lot of the time, and I do think that people who do astrology as a hobby and for their friends and to get a better idea of their own psyche can be really great people. But I feel as a whole, I don't think it's not my favorite thing in the universe. Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about grapefruit. Because grapefruit is an interesting one. Grapefruit is a post-Columbian exchange fruit, and it can mess with basically a whole bunch of different things. So the oils in the skin of grapefruit cause photosensitivity, which means basically they can lead to chemical burns. Grapefruit isn't named after actual grapes, but sea grapes, which are similarly bitter. Red grapefruit is a mutation, and grapefruit can basically mess with a whole bunch of different medications, especially statins, which are a circulatory medication, and it can amplify or reduce the dose, and it's really a crapshoot. So I really miss being able to eat grapefruit, and yeah. So yeah. In addition to citrus causing photosensitivity, Queen Anne's lace, celery, and other umbelloids can also cause photosensitivity. So if you get sunburns, easily be cautious about that. It's basically the same thing as your chemical exfoliators like tretinoin, retin-A, if you use it. But again, it's all in the dosage. If there was one thing Paracelsus was right about in between being rude to women and poisoning people with mercury, it was that you can have a very useful compound, and it's the dosage that changes things. I believe guasa is the scrapey thing. A lot of traditional medicine in China actually is based on similar but not identical principles. Like I mentioned, the 5 elements in yin yang and cold and hot principles. But you also had some miasma theory going on back then, and in Chinese medicine as well. Miasma theory is actually the reason that you had public baths and fairly good public plumbing in a lot of places before you had germ theory. That, yeah. Yep, statins are for cholesterol control. They can also mess. Grapefruit is just a real big mess, and I don't know why I like it. Let's see, what else? I also didn't talk about mushrooms at all, and that's because most mushrooms want to kill you. Even our beloved button mushrooms are moderately carcinogenic, but only if you eat a ton of them a ton of the time. Yeah. And they can make you allergic to yourself. They can be hallucinogenic a lot of the time. There are some mushrooms associated with traditional medicine, such as Trametes versicolor, also known as turkey tail, which is from Turtle Island, the Americas. It grows on stumps mostly. If you see it growing on the ground, it's actually on an underground stump. But yeah, please contact your doctor, or if your doctor's no good, contact somebody who isn't me before you try anything exciting with your health. Let's see, what else? Yeah, there really wasn't much of a distinction between alchemy and medicine, just like there wasn't much of a distinction between astronomy and astrology. People just mixed everything together pretty much. And that's very interesting. I would say, so how complete was the alchemy? If y'all don't mind me going on an alchemy tangent for a little bit, because this is one of my favorite things from undergrad. Basically, the idea of alchemy was completing the grand work, which was developing lead into gold and creating the elixir of immortality or what have you. And so basically people would have these alchemical manuals, these grimoires that were coded and would have different illustrations as their recipes. So this is likely actually an alchemical recipe for something. And if you could decipher these symbols, you could turn this into a viable recipe. You'd go through your manual page by page by page, doing each and every individual recipe. And then once you reach the end, you'd be enlightened and you'd know how to get the elixir of life. And obviously, if it didn't work, it was your fault and not the manuals. So you would have to start from the beginning again. And yeah, that was a common rich people. Is it a recipe if it doesn't have the author's life story for it? No, I guess it's just a formula. F in the chat for it having been a recipe. But yeah, so these alchemical recipes were done in an occult manner. Occult not meaning relating to being spooky and stuff, but occult rather meaning hidden, that they hid all their stuff in these very suspect looking illustrations. And so it was hidden to all those but learned men, because of course women weren't alchemists and non-binary people weren't advertising their status back then. The whole ideas of occult and magic and some kind of barrier between the natural and supernatural worlds, that is, if you consider those two different worlds, that's really something that developed in like the late 19th century, like with Victorian era seance culture. Basically, especially with industrialization, a lot of the cottage industries and a lot of the cooperative village lifestyle had eroded. So people had to come up with other ways to make money. And one of the most popular ways to make money for people who needed it and to have a jolly old good time for rich people who could spend the money on it was to hold a seance. Now, this was particularly relevant in a time with a ton of child mortality and a lot of splitting up families due to basically industrial patterns of development. So what people would do was they would come up with lots of gimmicks, such as photographs of fairies that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle believed in. And whereas for centuries or millennia even, people believed that the natural and so-called supernatural were one and the same. They were tied together. The idea of there being a barrier about having to cross over to talk to ghosts or whatever was really a later development. And shout out, like, there was this one Victorian era person. She was a psychic who got arrested for fake ectoplasm. I need to look this up because it's absolutely wild. And ectoplasm was again something coined. Helen Duncan, yeah. And she was actually arrested for witchcraft. The last person arrested under the Witchcraft Act, because she kept on vomiting up gauze at her seances and claiming it was ectoplasm. She also used various other methods. I've linked the Wikipedia page for y'all to have fun with, but it's very interesting. Now, the idea of lack of separation between the natural and supernatural worlds was also pretty prominent in Japanese culture in the Edo period, where there would be encyclopedias that had kappa alongside regular foxes, like, and again, once publication became a big thing and became profitable enough, both in Edo Japan and in Europe, people would just make things up wholesale. All right, I didn't get it all into patent medicines, and we have like 9 minutes, but I know a thing or two about that. Yes, regular, normal, non-anomalous foxes. Patent medicines developed. The actual snake oil wasn't actually non-effective, but it was a dupe of the snake oil that led to the coining of the term snake oil. Most patent medicines, well, there's a reason why we don't have them around anymore and why we have things like the FDA. It's because they could contain anything. Give your baby morphine. It is fine under the patent medicine philosophy of things. Just the late 19th century was a time when people were both indulging more in scientific concepts than ever before, but also just utilizing them in very commercialized ways, is how I would describe it. Let's see what else. Oh, I'm not sure how true this is because my professor just said it offhand, but apparently one of the reasons why bow ties were popularized and the idea of having your cravat close to your neck in general is because if you were a surgeon or doing one of those completely ethically sourced dissections for medical school, for example, you didn't want your cravat dragging in the entrails, not because of hygiene, but because it was oh so very déclassé. So they came up with different ways to tie the cravat that eventually developed into bow ties because, you know, they didn't have gloves, they didn't wash their hands, and they didn't want to have to launder their cravats. All right, public surgeries. So before anesthetic, specifically general anesthetic, because local anesthetic in the form of alcohol had been around for millennia, but before anesthetic and aseptic technique were developed, basically the idea was to get, to get the surgery done as quickly and efficiently as possible, and to get it over with. And often surgeries were a public event. Like, there was this one surgeon, he was the best surgeon of his time because he could cut a limb off someone in under a minute, and they bit down on the bullet, or a piece of gauze or what have you. And basically the goal was just get in and get out quickly as possible. It became a public spectacle due to Victorians in general being like that. And there were surgeries where, well, the 300% mortality rate was when, here, let's just pull it up. 300% mortality surgery. All right. Yep, it was Robert Liston, not to be confused with Robert Lister, who was aseptic technique. And he killed his assistant and stabbed a spectator as well during it. So Robert Liston, not Robert Lister, has nothing to do with Listerine either, though Lister has to do with Listerine. Let's see what else. So we've got 5 minutes left. If y'all have anything you want me to talk about, I'm just going off the top of my head. I really prepared minimally for this because I wanted people to feel like they could ask whatever and I would have time to either Google it or lie. I don't actually lie in these things, but to either Google it or answer it off the top of my head. Let's see, what else? Can I give you medical advice? Legally, no. Morally, also no. Ethically, no. Physically, go to a doctor, please. I can say, please, if think, would Paracelsus do it? And then you should probably not do it, is my recommendation. Yeah. I don't know. Medicine is interesting because it was both educated, but it wasn't something associated with the nobility so much. Yeah. And there are, I don't know. Yeah. Hippocrates and the Hippocratic corpus basically had this root of the same different wellness tips you'll get today, which is exercise well, eat a food, take a shower. But the devil's in the details, guys. Do not take advice. Yeah. How does this relate to Lolita even? I'm just here. Yeah. What's another thing? Oh, leeches. Yeah. So I forgot to talk about leeches, but I have 3 minutes, so let's make them count. Leeches are awful, dreadful little creatures that eat your blood. That's what they're good at. They swell up real big when they eat your blood. Now, leeches, in a philosophy like humorism, where having too much blood could cause illness, were a super great boon because they clench on, they steal your blood with an anticoagulant, and they leave. And leeches and maggots, as you mentioned, Molly Moonflower, are still both used in medical practice today, albeit not in the same way. But basically, leeches were a cure-all for anything that you would have too much blood to cause. So if your illness was associated with too much hot and dry in any way, or if they just felt like it, in come the leeches. Yeah, so maggots are interesting because they actually have medical maggots nowadays. They're raised aseptically, and that means they don't got germs in them, and they only eat dead tissue. So they're the gentlest way to take away the dead tissue on burns. But it can be really creepy and spoopy when someone is in the hospital and they're like, yeah, let's send in the maggots. This is a normal thing. Yeah, please do not use maggots at home. Only store-bought maggots. Yeah. Oh boy. And it's very interesting how things have come around that way to where we recognize professional maggots. Let's see. Ginger was used for stomach aches for millennia. Heck, through the colonial period in the US, you had ginger, and that's about it. Yeah. There are a gazillion different things about early medicine and natural magic, and most of them are awful. Penicillin was in the early 20th century. Natural variants of the penicillium yeast fungus don't actually produce enough penicillin to be useful, but they found a really lucky mutation that just oozes it out, and that's why it was available for the world wars, was because it was a mutation of it. You can get penicillium from brie cheese or certain types of moldy bread. However, it's not going to be as effective as real penicillium bred for penicillin. Also, don't overuse your antibiotics or you'll breed. No, moldy bread is an antibiotic. Willow bark is the painkiller. That's what aspirin or ASA for you who have maintained Bayer's copyright trademark. That acetosalicylic acid, the root for salicylic is the Latin word for willow, and that's where willow bark comes from. So willow bark tea is actually effective for headaches, but don't use it because it's not a controlled dosage. And also, why are you drinking tree bark? Anyway, I think that's about all I can think of off the top of my head. And I'm 1 minute into my grace period, so if y'all have any other questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm gonna unswamp myself. See y'all later. Bye-bye.